Well, hi, everybody. So the book you're looking at, The Black Cabinet, was written by Dr. Jill Watts. She's a professor out in California, and I'm so excited that I get to talk to her today. Jill, welcome. So glad you're here.
Well, thank you, Barry. It's such a honor to be able to talk to you.
Well, I just absolutely loved the book. And I guess I have to start with the question that you've probably been asked a million times by people who are not historians. What was the Black Cabinet?
Um, a lot of people don't know about it. It only gets a small mention in history texts, maybe a few sentences, but that's usually at the college level. The Black Cabinet is a group of African American advisors who came in under FDR to work in the New Deal, which is the plan to solve the Great Depression. And it's unrecognized by the president. It's an unofficial group, but an official unofficial group. Um, the African American advisors organized themselves into the Black Cabinet, and the name is given to them by the Black press. So it includes educators, journalists, lawyers, social workers, scholars who have been recruited to come into the New Deal and advise on New Deal programs.
One of the things that fascinated me about it was that they had almost no direct contact with the president.
Mhm.
Only one member really ever got to talk to the president on a consistent basis. Who was that?
That was Mary McLeod Bethune. That's right. And so in 1936, she becomes appointed as the first African American woman to head a federal program, which she heads a division of the National Youth Administration, which is designed to give African American youth education and jobs and training. And so her presence is so important because she marshals the group together. They're a Black cabinet, but they're kind of working separately throughout the administration. And she says, you know, we've got to get together and we've got to share information in a more formal way. And what's so important is she has this friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt that dates back many years through the Women's Club movement. And so she becomes the channel to the White House. Up until then, there was almost no way at all for the Black cabinet to reach FDR in the White House. They've pretty much been blocked.
How would you describe her personality? Because one of the things that I found in reading the book was she is a name that I think many people kind of recognize, but they don't really know who she was. And the deeper you got into her character and personal nature, the more I was like, boy, I want a time machine to go back and meet her.
Oh yeah, yeah. She is the quintessential educational activist, if you think about it. She is a teacher at her core and a tough one at that. So I think most of us know her for her contributions to education as the founder of Bethune-Cookman University. And schools bear her name throughout the country, actually, and community centers. But in terms of her personality, she was brilliant, she was dynamic, she was engaging. She had an incredible sense of organizations and how to organize people from the grassroots all the way up to the more kind of core of smaller group of federal employees. And she is absolutely unstoppable.
You
that's
really
that's
get
Mary
that
McLeod
sense.
Bethune.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
the other thing that intrigued me was she's really the only major woman to be in this organization.
Mhm. Mhm.
And most of the men in the organization, they're remarkably educated. They're
Oh
all
yeah.
coming out of either Harvard or Howard universities with fancy degrees. They're a generation younger than her. And they are all very deferential for the most part, to her, that you just get a sense of her charisma. So what I thought we would do for our audience is talk about how the development of African American voters coming into the Democratic Party happened. But after the Civil War, African Americans who were able to vote voted Republican because that was the party of Lincoln and the party of Grant and the party of Reconstruction. into the 20th century, we're now getting to be a generation removed from the Civil War. And Teddy Roosevelt makes a big deal about inviting the first Black guest to have dinner at the White House. But slowly, as your book explains, Teddy Roosevelt starts to take power away from Black civil servants. And he was replaced after his terms by William Howard Taft. And can you relate what Taft said about Black voters in the Republican Party?
Yeah, well, the thing about Taft is, like you said, he takes office after Roosevelt, and Roosevelt's commitment to Black voters, he invites Booker T. Washington to the White House. They have dinner. Then he denies it in the press because he gets a pushback. And the Republican Party by that point is already trying to court white Southerners and thinks that that voting bloc could help them win. Okay, so they haven't really figured that formula out, but in one of the ways they do it, they have to distance themselves from Black voters. And you see that become even more and more apparent during Taft's administration. Taft is not as interested as Roosevelt is at even kind of tipping his hat to Black voters. The idea amongst the Republicans was that Blacks were going to vote for them anyway, because they were the party of Lincoln. African Americans were going to be loyal to the party of Lincoln regardless. So in Taft, there is a core of African American advisors who come under Roosevelt, and actually that's when the first name, the Black cabinet, is used for that earlier group. And then with Taft, you see them slowly kind of losing power and being dismissed, and the ranks shrink, basically, the ranks of people who might have a little bit of influence. And there's an episode where they're trying to gather African American officials and meet with Taft, and Taft pledges that he's going to give a speech that shows his dedication to African Americans. Then they say, okay, well, we'll write something for you, and then they start sending it to him, right? And actually, his response was to basically ignore them. And then actually, one of the first speeches, he says, I can't come out with such a speech. And then on the second one, he says, I'm not going to say anything on any of the subjects set out. I think it cheeky to ask it. Cheeky to ask it. So even though he solicits this in this meeting, at the same time, he doesn't want it. So you can kind of see the tension that's building even in 1912. That's a long time before the Black cabinet comes in under FDR. You can see that tension building between the African American voters and the Republican Party that they have actually supported very, very faithfully since Reconstruction.
The speech that Taft refuses to give wasn't calling for the immediate desegregation of America. It was really calling for just more equal treatment for Black people, for a call for an anti-lynching law. It was, by today's standards, so mild and moderate that it's almost, as I was reading your book, I was looking going, why in the world could he not give this speech? So in the 1920s, and up until the election of FDR, African-American voters find themselves between a rock and a hard place. The Democrats are still the party of racist white Southern Democrats, and the Republicans take them for granted and don't do anything for them. And African-Americans were 10% of the population. Now, in fairness, a high percentage of those folks couldn't vote because they were in the South, where their rights were being taken away. But neither party seems to really make a significant effort to sign them up, to say, wait a minute, if I can add 10% to our vote, that's a good vote total. So why was it difficult for FDR in 1932 to convince African-American voters that they should support a Democrat for president?
have a feeling if you talked to FDR in 1932, he would have said, that's not on my agenda. I'm not interested in the Black vote. The Democrats had always sought to appease white Southerners. And even though FDR is a Northerner, he has a home in Georgia, and he has strong Southern ties in that way. So I don't think that was on his radar up until probably the fall, just before the election, when the possibility of African American voters crossing over appears through the newspaper publisher Robert Vann. And Robert Vann's a really key player in the Black cabinet. Previous to this, he's been a key player in the Republican Party. He's been a loyal Republican, and over again, Vann has brought Black votes out for Republicans. And over again, they have passed him up for appointments. It just basic appointments at the state level. And I think he'd always hoped to have a federal appointment where he could go in. It's not just personal ambition. He feels like he can go to Washington and make a change and have a voice there and bring an African-American voice in. So Robert Vann has become fed up with the Republicans, and he's not the only Black Republican that's become fed up. So he crosses over, makes a very dramatic speech in September 1932, where he endorses FDR and says it's time to turn Lincoln's picture to the wall. Our debt has been paid. And so we need to go with the party that has our best interests at heart, and it's going to be the Democrats. That was earth-shattering, absolutely earth-shattering.
And in fairness, African-American voters were very savvy, and they had seen what had happened under Hoover, that Hoover wasn't going to do anything to help them. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a choice between two unknowns. It was a choice between a known that was negative and an unknown who at least superficially seemed to be positive. But talk a little more, if you would, about Franklin Roosevelt and his relationship with African Americans. He comes across in your book as really rather diffident and aloof from the issue. It doesn't seem to be anything that he's really cares about. His only Black contact is his butler and his butler's wife, who do seem to have some influence with him. Mm-hmm. But although Roosevelt is champion of the forgotten people, he doesn't seem to be at all interested in race relations.
No, I don't think, I think if you, well, I guess if you asked Mary McLeod Bethune, she would have said he was, but no, I don't think he was that interested in race relations. Bethune talked about Roosevelt as being a practical politician, that FDR was about practicality. And there's that famous FDR quote, if you don't have more than a 50% chance of winning, you don't fight the battle, right? You got to have a greater chance than 50%. So, but yeah, and let me say this too, I don't mean to go off on a tangent, but I want to acknowledge that part of the consciousness that we associate Roosevelt with, forgotten man, forgotten woman, the common American, and we even associate him with the African American cause, that is because of Eleanor Roosevelt. Mm-hmm. And it's because she I think during the first term, she grows in her own understanding and consciousness. I think she's predisposed towards sympathy towards the African American community, but I think it's during that first term it solidifies, and I think to a great degree because of Mary McLeod Bethune. Once Bethune arrives in Washington, D.C., that friendship between them goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And even Eleanor Roosevelt would agree that Bethune tutors her on race relations. We talk today so much about how to be an anti-racist. Bethune was doing that in the 1930s, in the 20s, in the teens. She was working with people to talk about how to be an anti-racist. So you have to give Bethune a great credit for Eleanor Roosevelt's consciousness raising. And then in terms of what her impact on the president was, like I said, Bethune would say that FDR, if he could have, would have supported civil rights, but he saw it as a long process. And that
So the core of the Black cabinet are, at first, just a few extremely educated, very dedicated African American men who get jobs in the federal government. And they're kind of playing a long game between, first of all, we want to do our job well here because it was their livelihood and they had pride, but also they were working together to say, how can we now open more doors? The actor Jack Lemmon used to have a saying. He said, if you become successful, it's your responsibility to send the elevator back down. And you really get that sense with the Black cabinet, that they are not only trying, in the words of the time, to be good representatives of their race, but also to say, let's start pushing whatever buttons we can within our spheres of influence to open more doors. And they don't always agree on what those doors are or how it should be done. That's part of what makes the book so enjoyable. They're not monolithic, and there's personal rivalries, but it's quite fascinating. The friendship, though, between Mary McLeod Bethune and Eleanor Roosevelt was a real friendship. It wasn't a political friendship. They genuinely liked one another, and that opens the door to at least Roosevelt hearing some of these concerns, even when he can't act on them. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the Chicago connection to all this, because getting into the Black cabinet itself was hard because there were so few federal jobs at an influential level available for African Americans. What was the Rosenwald list, and how did that affect everything?
Oh, I think the Rosenwald Foundation, the list is so important. So probably all the Chicago folks know that Julius Rosenwald was one of the founders of the Sears and Roebuck Company. And the thing about him is he took the millions that he made, made millions in a time when millions were like billions. And he took that money and donated it. And one of the great causes that he supported was African American education. In fact, one of the early causes he supported was Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute, and subsequently then funded the building of Black schools and Black community centers, and supported Black curriculum throughout the South, actually. So he was instrumental, and he's a key political player in that way too, right? So so the Rosenwald Foundation also sponsored studies, and that led them to all kinds of connections with scholars of both races. So they do so much, and I don't think we talk enough about them. So because of those ties, the Rosenwald Foundation is able to pressure the FDR administration to a degree. They play a big role in the establishment of the first office, where you find African Americans are recruited to come in and talk about the New Deal. And because they actually fund that office in the early years, right? The government pays $1 a year for the people who work in that office. The Rosenwald Foundation funds the rest of it. And this was a way of bringing that office in without having to run it past the white Southern coalition that FDR is so worried about losing. He doesn't want to lose white votes from the South. So they bring it in. The Rosenwald Foundation pays for it initially with the government funding it like $1 a year. And they also then have a great say on who gets those positions initially. So you kind of had to come in with the Rosenwald approval for the most part. So Robert Weaver, who becomes, much later, he comes as one of the first members of the Black cabinet, first PhD in economics from Harvard, just a terrific scholar, an amazing studies that he's done, collecting data to prove that African Americans are not actually originally being served at all by the New Deal. It's actually hurting them. He's one of the first recruits, and he's on the Rosenwald list. So So it's a kind of very elite group within the government of highly educated people who come in under the Rosenwald Foundation. So,
And Weaver, of course, goes on to have such an amazing career,
yes.
bouncing back and forth between public service and education. And under Lyndon Johnson becomes the first African American
Mhm.
cabinet officer and does a spectacular job, and then leaves that and continues going on. Again, another name that I think people should know more about.
He has strong Chicago ties because after he leaves working in DC, he comes to Chicago there and heads the mayor's committee on race relations for some time. So,
Yeah, he's fascinating. And the last thing I want to ask you about, because there's so much in this book. The book is long and it's wonderful. I enjoyed every page of it. There's so much. We could do a whole nother section on the onset of World War II and the fight to desegregate the military, and how Roosevelt finessed that, and how the Black Cabinet really, I think it's one of their greatest accomplishments. Although they don't get the military desegregated under Roosevelt, they do push to get many more opportunities for groups we know, like the Tuskegee Airmen, but also for people we don't know about, making sure that skilled African American welders and electricians begin to get hired for jobs that the unions had locked them out of. Okay, so your last question is, if I could give you a time machine and you could go back and talk to any member of the Black Cabinet, who would you most love to have gotten to know?
oh, that's hard because I want to know all of them.
Yeah,
But
me too.
I only get one.
You get one.
It have to be Mary McLeod Bethune.
Yeah.
Absolutely. She's such a role model in so many ways. To know her and know her life and see her perspective, to be able to um, just learn from her would be just the ultimate experience for any historian, educator, any woman. I think the thing about what we don't think about is how instrumental she was in bringing African Americans into the Democratic Party, and how political she was. We think of her as an educator and a reformer, but she was really a political person, and that just is so important. She's part of that migration. You know, we talk about the Democratic Party owing Black women a great debt. Well, right there, that's where one of the major debts is owed, is through her. So
I
she's just,
I think you couldn't possibly argue against her. She just seems like she'd be the most fascinating person to sit and have lunch with and talk with. I want to thank you so much for this conversation. I want to mention that you are the author of several other wonderful books, including the definitive biography of Hattie McDaniel, the first African American actress to win an Academy Award. But then also focusing on her battle to desegregate Los Angeles, a
yeah.
part of her life that I think most people assume after she played Mammy, she went on to great riches and fame, and that's not really what happened for her.
Mm.
But I know that there has been interest in making a movie about her, and I hope that this book inspires some great filmmaker to make a movie about Mary McLeod Bethune. And I hope you'll join us again when we have a chance to talk about World War II and African Americans and the amazing role the Black Cabinet played. I want to encourage all of you to read the book. I'm going to put it up again on the screen so you can see it. Dr. Jill Watts, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you, Barry. It's just been such a pleasure. I really appreciate it.